Hello and welcome to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I am Rebecca Hartwell, the developmental editor behind Heartbound Editing. It is my goal to help authors turn their stories into bestsellers or masterworks that can change their world. Today's guest is Jocelyn Montana, and I am so excited to bring you all a slightly different episode than the usual author interviews I have done in the past. I had the pleasure of having Jocelyn on to talk about her books a few months ago, but today she is joining us instead as a fellow structural editor, and we are going to talk about some of the most common mistakes we see authors make. Welcome, Jocelyn.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me back.
So, to start off, why don't you introduce a little bit about your background in structural and developmental editing?
Sure. Yeah, I got into it kind of a little bit through the back door, I suppose you could say. I wrote my very first book and I sent it to an editor and I figured, oh, I got this, like everything's gonna look pretty good. It's just she's gonna do more like copy editing. And she sent it back to me and there was a lot there and a lot about the point of view I was using and starting sentences all the same. And I realized, wow, I don't really know uh a lot about about writing. I don't know how to properly structure a novel. There are things with writing and sentence structure, that the craft kind of stuff that obviously we all strive to kind of get better at, and you only get better at by writing more and more and more. But I realized that there was a lot that I didn't know, and so I did kind of what I do with all my hobbies. I decided to do a deep dive, and I also wanted to approach it like a career. And I thought, like, all right, well, for my career, for me, the right path was I went to school and I took, an undergraduate courses that I needed for, like, to set that foundation and that base. So that's how I was thinking about it. So I started just buying books on structure, on craft. Yeah, exactly. Like, look at your bookshelves behind you that I'm looking at. And I just started reading them. And I was connected with a lot of other writers that I was partnering with or giving critique feedback. And I realized it was making me be a better critique partner. I was able to really help them in deeper ways. And I had a better language and vocabulary to talk to them about the things that I was seeing. Like, I could actually describe it better and say, oh, well, this isn't working because of this. Like, I knew what the because was, instead of just saying, just feeling like something's not right here. And I realized that I had read all of the course books for the developmental editor course, put through by EFA, which is the Freelance Editors Association. So
Mhm.
I realized, okay, well, I've already done a lot of that prep work, so I'm going to take the course and get certified. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And I'm still discovering and reading craft books and working on that. But that led me to volunteering to be a judge for different writing contests. So at this point, I've judged 4 contests over the past 2 years. And it's been a really, really great experience. And I think that one of the things about doing, volunteering to be a judge for a first round. So typically, the way, for those who may not know, usually it's like you're sending your first chapter or the first 5,500 words, 10,000 words of your story. And the first round judges, we have a score sheet and we score each element. So one thing that I started noticing is a lot of the same kinds of, um, just weaknesses, weak areas for people were coming up throughout these contests, through the, I don't know, dozens and dozens of first chapters that I've read. So I thought that today, while we were going to chat, it would be great for people who are starting out, or even more established people, especially people who may even want to enter their book into a contest, or if they're going to go traditional. I think a lot of the things that we look at and in a first round are the same things that an editor or an agent are going to pick up on as they're looking at your query package, which typically is going to include maybe the first 5,000 words or the first chapter with your query letter and your synopsis. So I think there's some cool things to talk about with that.
And I'm very excited to do so. I think it's fascinating that you came into this as an editor, or sorry, as an author, and just realizing how little you didn't know, because I think that's where pretty much every author ends up on their first piece is they finish it, and obviously that is a huge accomplishment and they should celebrate the crap out of that. But the next steps of realizing, oh, I don't know where to do paragraph breaks, or I don't know what beats I need to hit in a romance. There's such a huge world of both story and writing craft that they aren't even aware they should be paying attention to. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
great that you started there and that that is very much what we're going to be tackling today and hopefully giving listeners a bit of a head start on that. So what is the first topic that you want to dive in on that today?
Yeah. So I have four, and there's sort of like four bigger categories, and then there's like little kind of subcategories within each one. So I thought that we could start maybe with what the first couple of questions usually are in a judging contest, which is around what I called the larger category of plot. But there's always questions on, does the book hook you in? Are you captivated by what's going on? Do you want to continue reading? And in those first couple of pages or that first chapter is there backstory? Is there a lot of dumping of information that's dragging the story down? So this is something where you see some weaknesses with people not necessarily starting the story it with a big bang. If you think about it, most readers are going to click on the, see inside the book on Amazon, or they're going to pick the book off the shelf and they're going to skim the first paragraph maybe. Um, they don't spend a lot of time making a decision. So you really need to use that real estate, those first few lines, as strategically as possible. And I, I think that seeing, with some people maybe starting with um exposition or trying to kind of set up the story instead of jumping right into the story, you really want to do something, and this is kind of a literary term. You want to start your book in media res, which is Latin for in the middle of something. So, in the middle of the action, your readers will hang in there for quite some time to figure out what's going on if they're really captivated by the immediate action scene. Uh, so in fantasy, starting with a big, magical instance, or something big happening that just will draw people into the world and really get them excited and invested. Then that first sentence or first couple of sentences are well crafted, are exciting, maybe have some kind of mystery or question to it. I was fortunate enough to take a like beginner hook, like start of your book hook class, where we analyze some great, starting sentences in books. And you could even think like really going back, like really old school, right? Dickens, Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Well, as an
Great.
author, you're like, well, why? I mean, as a reader, you're like, well, why? That's a really interesting sentence. So you could just Google top first sentences. Pride and Prejudice is another one, which I know I'm not going to quote 100% accurately, and I should have pulled it up, but it's like, any rich man is in want of a wife. And that sentence is perfectly posed to both set the tone of the book, the subject of the book, and it is also funny and interesting. So
And I
you
would
could,
recommend just looking through, bestsellers in your genre and seeing which lines stand out, which first lines maybe got mentioned in the reviews of that book. There's a lot of research you can do into that.
Yeah, yeah, no, excellent, excellent point. So think about that. So think about your first sentence, your first paragraph, really drawing people in.
I love that you bring that up as your first topic. I recently taught a 2-hour class specifically on writing really hooky first chapters that will draw readers into the story, making it possible for them to stop reading it through Fiction Refinery, which was so much fun. And I absolutely look forward to turning that into a blog post or a podcast episode
Oh,
here or
yeah.
something, because there's so much that goes into that. And it has such a disproportionate effect on how the reader connects with the story to come.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that because I mentioned like I took that class and that was years ago. I took that class on, opening lines and opening paragraph and it had a long-lasting effect for me. So you're doing that now, which is great that people can grab that resource and hone in on that.
So, what's the second topic that you're going to take us through today for things that you commonly see people making mistakes and how to fix that?
Yeah, it's around pacing. And that's and I'm going to kind of quantify that with think about your scenes. And Rebecca, you do a really, really great job with writing very detailed and pointful and impactful scenes.
Well, thank you.
So think about for a writer, think about the scene that you're setting up. Don't is it the right if you're bringing a scene onto the story, make sure that you're grounding the reader in description, that there's a point to that scene. Every scene should bring around something with the motivation in the story, the conflict in the story, or the goal of the story. And that could even be their internal goal. So maybe something with the character and what they need, and you're representing that. Every single scene needs to have it to represent at least one of those things. Often it'll have multiple, and then it should also be doing other things like maybe developing some of those layers of the character or maybe some subplots, other things that could come in. But every scene really needs to have a reason to be there. And I think what I've seen in some of the submissions is where they have one chapter, but then maybe they have 6 or 7 asterisk breaks, and some of them are just a paragraph long. That's not really helping the story. For one, if you're switching back and forth, say you're doing a dual point of view, say romance, you're doing the hero and the heroine, I'm not really getting a chance to get to know either one of them if I'm only in their head for a couple of paragraphs, a page, 2 pages. Sometimes it is okay to do that. I don't wanna say, like, never, never do that. It's just especially for your first chapter, there are a couple of things you really want, and I was gonna talk about this later when I talk about character, but you really want your reader to fall in love with the character and to have empathy for the character and be like, "Okay, this is someone who I wanna be in their head for the rest of this story. I wanna understand what's gonna happen to them, how they're gonna deal with things." And we'll talk about how you can do that later, but the the point is if you're switching point of view or even you're switching scenes within the same character's point of view, the reader doesn't have a chance to really get to know them. They don't have a chance to sink into the story in each one of these scenes. So I see that happen quite a bit. And I think sometimes if I try to analyze why, it's they want to move the story forward. And maybe there's something they feel they want to raise as a crucial point. And so they just write, a kind of a quick scene of the character in their kitchen, maybe thinking about that point as they want to raise it. But just I would just challenge people to figure out how to get the the crux of what you want and how you're driving that story forward, and just make sure that you're really setting those scenes. And there's some great books on scenes out there. I really like Jordan Rosenfeld, Rosenfeld. She has 2 books on scenes that I would highly recommend if anyone wanted to kind of dive deeper into crafting scenes, different types of scenes. So that was the second one that I wanted to bring up that we see under under judging with plot.
I'm so glad you do because I think I would rank that as my number one thing that I see as a developmental editor. And I love that you are approaching it as not so much the speed of the writing or length of paragraph or sentence, because that's not the pacing issues that I see so often. It's simply that a scene or a chapter, if a chapter is one full scene, doesn't have a core event, or that
Mhm.
that core event does not change anything, does not mean anything to the global plot, or just simply isn't presented in an interesting way. That is absolutely my number one thing, and I had a note here to talk about that, so I'm glad that you brought that up preemptively, and I totally agree with everything you said. So what's number
Yeah.
3?
Yeah. No, great. Um, so the third one, it kind of goes along with that a little bit, but it's just making sure that your plot, that you have your goal, motivation, and conflict very clearly set up for the story. It doesn't mean that all of those things are going to be present in your first chapter. We're talking about in a judging contest, we're usually just in the first chapter, but make sure you have that crafted for the story. You know exactly what the character is going to be going for. And that goal could change throughout the book, and that's totally fine. But make sure you really know what those three things are. You know, what they want, why they want it, and what's going to prevent them from getting it. That's the goal, motivation, and conflict. And that's going to happen both for an external plot and an internal plot. And if we're talking romance, which is, my particular expertise, that's what I write, that's what I critique, that's what I, you know, edit and work on, is a lot of those internal parts, so the internal goal, motivation, and conflict are going to be around the romantic relationship. We talk a lot about in romance that usually the hero and the heroine, they have some kind of wound that is keeping them from being able to fall in love and have their happy ever after. So you want to make sure you understand and know how you're going to integrate that into the story. And at the start of the story, you can kind of hint, like, why are they, why would a relationship be something that's good for them? Why is this love story going to be something that's important to happen to them? And why do they deserve love? And maybe what's lacking? And that can be presented kind of right off the bat. You want to make sure that goal, motivation, and conflict is going to be strong enough for the entire book. We're not talking about just little arguments between the hero and the heroine, or the hero and hero, or any iteration um of the book. I know I might be kind of defaulting to hero and heroine because that's what I write, but I definitely read for hero and heroine, and hero books as well, and really enjoy those stories too. So sorry about that I might be slipping into that. um but so just making sure that where the story is going to have that goal, motivation, and conflict set up throughout the story, and kind of being able to hint at that, or show that, or maybe even like leading up to that inciting incident. That in romance, a lot of that is the meet cute, when the you know to hero, heroine, or hero, interact for the first time, or for the first time that's important in this story, because it could be a second chance romance.
Yeah, and one of the ways that I really like to try to talk to my clients about goal, motive, and conflict when they're struggling to understand it is very simply that goal is whatever they are chasing, and bonus points if there's something they think they want that they're chasing, and a different something that they actually need that they will have to fulfill by the end. Motive is simply whatever they are running away from. So thinking about that as a magnet, you have the goal pulling them forward, you have the motivation pushing them in that same direction from something that they're running away from. And conflict is something that I could probably do a whole podcast episode on, because it doesn't just have to be interpersonal. It doesn't have to be the hero fighting the villain or the lovers having an argument. It can be internal. It can be having conflict within yourself about different things that you want or ways that you need to change. It can be with other people. It can be with your arena. I have read some fantastic stories where the conflict is between the person trying to enact the story and the world around them is trying to stop them or being that hurdle either through society, for example, historical novels with a same-sex couple, or the environment, such as in a fiction fantasy where they get stuck on the North Pole and they have to just survive the elements. So conflict is so often, I think, simplified to lover fighting with lover or hero, sword fighting with villain. And there are so many other ways to include that, and having that variety and knowing the different ways that you can use it, introduce it is very, very important. So I highly recommend looking more into those topics as you develop your writing and as you want to start using them more. So
Yeah. No, that's the great points because you talking about different kinds of conflict. So Twister, right? We just had the sequel. That's completely the conflict is completely a weather phenomenon, right? That's
yeah,
the whole that's the whole conflict throughout the entire movie.
right.
Jaws, it's a shark, right? So yes, it can be all sorts of things. It could be that maybe someone was married before and they don't ever want to get married again. They're not open and vulnerable. They're not willing to be open and vulnerable. That's something within themselves that they really have to work through and make the choice, right? The choice to let love in. And so that can be really powerful
Absolutely,
and
because
and
the romance wounds that you mentioned earlier are a great internal conflict, and it's fun to look at even just within an internal conflict. It can be something like that. If, "Oh, hey, my heart was broken in the past. I don't want to love again," or you can take it to the other end of the literal spectrum and have it be something like the Venom movie, where it's literally a parasite inside him that he has almost all of his conflict with. So you can play with it in so many fun ways.
yeah, no, absolutely. Another good one with the internal conflict is Black Swan, where she's got this, she's battling. I mean, one of the reasons she won an Oscar, or Natalie Portman won an Oscar for her performance, is if you look at a lot of her like moments, she's acting and she's completely by herself. She's in a bathroom by herself and she has to show us that she's having this, huge internal conflict. I mean, it's pretty incredible. It's an incredible performance, but it's just, some good examples that people could think about.
Yeah.
And the Hunger Games, if you were to reread the Hunger Games, look at both the external and the internal conflict. Obviously, the external is really clear. She's getting tossed into an arena and she has to fight for her life, but she has a ton of internal things going on. She's not willing to trust people. She really fights against kind of the counterpart to her, PETA, who's very giving and open, and she's just so closed, and she's close to it. She doesn't, want to see that. So I think there's a lot of really cool stuff in that story too that you could study, and a lot of people have read or seen the movies.
Absolutely.
So my fourth underplot is backstory. So how do you introduce backstory into a book? What is the appropriate amount? And I think especially for those of us in that are writing fantasy or paranormal, we really want people to understand our world. We want them to understand the context, how people are relating to each other, and maybe what the magic is. But James Bell, in one of his writing books, I think it's maybe Plot and Structure. I think it's that one. I've got quite a few of his writing books. He tells authors that he's working with that you should keep it to one line of backstory in your first 2,500 words, two paragraphs in your first, I think maybe 5,000 to 7,500 words. And, really just dribs and drabs as it goes on. Like I said before, your readers will stick with you. They will, if they're really invested and they're getting engaged with the character and they're falling in love with your character or your story, they're going to stick around to figure out how the magic works. They're going to want to know what the world is all about. And so you don't need to kind of hit them over the head with dumping a lot of, backstory about who the character is, what's been done to them in the past, or what's going on in the world or setting that up, you're going to lose your readers, to be a little bit more blunt about it, because they're just not going to be that invested. Like we said, starting your book in the middle of action, things are happening, there's stuff going on, and maybe you're showing some magic happening, or the character, talking to someone else, and it's clear that they're friends. You don't need to do a backstory of like how long they've been friends or why they're friends. You just don't, that can come in naturally, as maybe as the character is thinking later on in the story. But so just try to think about how much backstory you're introducing. And I think maybe people can even get a little bit confused on like, okay, what's backstory versus exposition? And I think that's fair. I think that, maybe talking to writing partners or reading books that'll help show you, so you can like kind of mentally be able to highlight, okay, this is backstory. This is the character kind of explaining what's, or thinking or processing what's going on, which is a little bit
Mhm.
more of like the narrative. And that might be appropriate if there's an action happening. They're kind of processing it and thinking about it. So maybe making sure that you understand like what the backstory is versus what's the narrative, because backstory is when you're going back in time and you're trying to explain like why something is the way it is. And definitely there's a lot of good books and resources out there about how to write backstory, how to incorporate it, how to do flashbacks in a way that helps your narrative and doesn't hurt it, because anytime you're taking your reader away from the current action, you're
Mhm.
kind of giving them an excuse to say, I'm not that interested in what happened in the past. I really want to know what's happening now. And they might tune out, they might close the book. That's why it's important to know how to use a flashback, correctly, which is when you're going to show the reader a complete scene that
Mhm.
happened in the past.
Right.
So definitely that's another kind of tip or trick, and I would highly recommend not putting flashbacks in until much later in your book, when you've got your reader completely committed to your character and your story and they love them, and then they're like, and then they're thinking, then when you're bringing up something from the past that's important or that traumatized them, or even it could even be something funny, but it has to be relevant to the
Totally.
story. It absolutely has to be relevant to the story. um, then that might be an
I actually
appropriate
have
time.
two like really clearly defined tools that I will offer my clients for dealing with exactly that. And the first one you've already kind of touched on, but I have a fun name for it that I stole from another book. And it's the cold mashed potatoes principle, which is if you have someone sitting at a table eating mashed potatoes and they're, they're thinking about how their grandmother made mashed potatoes better and their childhood, you never want to leave the moment long enough for the mashed potatoes to get cold. So just bearing in mind that if you're gonna do backstory, don't stick it all together. Do a sentence here and a sentence there and a sentence there, unless, like you said, you're doing a full scene that is a flashback. So there's the cold mashed potato principle, which is from a book that I recently read, which I'll absolutely name at the end because it was fantastic. And then the other one is one of my favorite tools of all time, and especially in helping first-time authors. And that is the idea of showing information just in time for it to be relevant, or just in case the reader needs it later. And this is the best tool that I've ever found for dealing with info dump and exposition. Because if you're presenting information, including backstory, very much including backstory, just in case a reader needs that information to understand what's going on, or just in case they need to know that about the character later when it becomes relevant, then it's info dump and it's exposition and it should not be there.
Hmm.
However, the exact same information can be used without it being info dump, without it being exposition, if you're presenting it when it's just in time to be needed and to be very relevant, which is very much what you were saying of tie it to the action, tie it to what the processing, to what's actually happening on the page. So between the idea of never leave the present moment for more than a sentence or three, and making sure that whatever backstory you're presenting is needed right then, rather than, well, I came up with it, so I'm going to put it in the book. That those two measures I have found do a lot to help with that particular issue, common issue in early writers' work.
Oh yeah, great. No, those are great tactics to have your readers, look at and evaluate. Yeah, that's wonderful.
So, what's up next?
Yeah, so switching now to style and talking about some weaknesses that come up when we're looking at some of the style categories while judging. The top one, and I know everyone's probably sick of hearing this, is showing versus telling, right? So, but it's really important, and especially in that first chapter, if you're really pushing yourself to be a deeper point of view, to show the action, to really immerse your readers into their character, and it can be whatever point of view, first person, present, first person past, the same with third. And even if you're writing maybe a little bit more limited versus deep third, which is very similar to first person, very very immersed into the character, showing versus telling works and is important in all of those kinds of points of view. And especially that first chapter, you really want your reader to adhere to the character, to really see the world and to see the story through their eyes. And that's where you get into kind of the fun nuance of the character because it's how they're processing things. Are they sarcastic? Are they, and even if it's inner monologues, so they're not saying anything to anyone, but it's, they're kind of having a sarcastic inner thought about, oh, great, he's at it again. Or, and it's just different ways you really can amp up what that character's like and their unique way of seeing the world. So the showing versus telling is definitely a big one where you see people struggling with that a little bit.
And it's by far probably the most common, just one sentence advice that I see given to every author on the planet is show, don't tell. And I actually have a bit of a caveat that I like to add to that because I don't think that that statement stands by itself. I have read multiple books or edited multiple books where the author took that too far, where they were doing nothing but showing. And the issue with that is that the reader is then left without meaning. So, showing is immersion, like you were talking about, which is great, especially in modern fiction, especially in genre fiction, especially in fantasy, which is my
Mhm.
wheelhouse. But if you take it too far, then you're showing the reader information without giving them the chance to understand what they're supposed to know about it or be influenced by in it. So I tend to recommend a balance, but most authors naturally lean on the side of too much telling, so the advice of show don't tell absolutely applies, but it's all about a balance because you want immersion in the showing, you want meaning in the telling, and you can use both to help your pacing as well. Because telling can help you speed over whatever events or days or time passage or travel the reader does not need to see. And in that case, that is the right choice. And in fight scenes, falling down more into the immersion can help it feel faster and more adrenaline, but at the same time, in the gentler scenes, doing more of that showing to kind of level things back out and just enjoy the setting is also going to help the pacing. So I love the advice of make sure that you're not telling too much, but also make sure that you're doing enough telling that the reader can understand what's happening. So
Yeah, yeah. Excellent, excellent point. It really should be phrased that the correct balance of
yeah,
showing and telling. And I think to your point, what I see a lot is most people a little too much telling, right? But
absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
important to understand that we're not saying never use telling. Telling is a very important and critical piece of writing. It's every single element that you're putting on a page. There's so many different what I call like parts of writing. You've got your action parts, you've got the inner monologue parts when the character's thinking about something. Then you've got the dialogue when they're speaking something. You've got like your exposition and the different elements there. And it is important to know, when when you're going to show something, when you're going to tell something. And to your point, when it's a critical scene, say a battle scene, say a love scene, things where you really need the reader, and in a romance, the reader really wants to be invested in those intimacy scenes, whatever level that is. It could just be when they finally start having a deeper emotional connection. But the reader really needs to feel it, to see it. Those are times when you're slowing the story down, you're diving into more showing, you're really getting into those emotions and processing those emotions. And but then, there, like you said, there's other parts where you really need to kind of summarize things. And it's important not to repeat things too. So you might want to just do something telling, like, oh, so she filled so and so in about what happened with Carla or whatever. You don't want to have her retell something that the reader's already read. So you have to use telling in those kinds of circumstances. So it's very useful. And thank you for bringing that up, to make sure it's not like only show, only show.
It's just one of my pet peeves. So I love the advice. I think it is applicable to like 90% of new authors, but having edited multiple books from like you need a lot more telling. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I like to explain it a bit more.
Yeah. No, that's great. Um, that's great.
So what's up next?
The next, I would say, is just, maybe very briefly, smooth point of view transitions. So for some people, this may not be relevant. You're going to be one person's character the entire book. But in that case, I would say making sure that you're setting your chapters to start and end at the right time, and that you're, hooking the reader and ending the chapter. It doesn't have to be like a cliffhanger every time, but that you're ending the chapter where they want more. Now, if you're switching between multiple point of views, making sure that it's really clear to the reader who's speaking and when. uh if you have even one time when a reader goes, wait, whose hat am I in? Then you failed as an author. You never want that to happen. You always want it to be really clear. So that's another one that I, yeah, wanted to bring up.
Well, you are the master of where to end chapters to keep readers hooked in. That is absolutely one of the things that stands out in your
Okay.
books, which I love. And I totally agree that the POV that you're in, how much time has passed since the last one, and where this is taking place all need to be clear in the first paragraph of any new chapter and possibly even every new scene. So, yeah, so glad you brought that up.
Uh, so two more, so just kind of quick. The first one, grammar, punctuation, spelling. If you're going to submit to a contest, make sure it doesn't have to be perfect, but at least with spelling, that there shouldn't be errors. Spell check could correct that.
Do you have any tips or tricks to help people maybe catch issues that they aren't seeing on the first read?
Well, I am a big fan, and I'm not affiliated with them, so I'm not like giving them a plug or anything. I love my pro writing aid. I use that as a great way to catch more nuanced things, um like, oh, maybe I started three sentences in a row with she, like she something, and you don't want to do that. You want it to be varied, and um so more nuanced elements there with style and grammar.
Yeah, yeah. And I will add for anyone who needs a totally free or non-AI option, I highly recommend two things. First of all, change your font in your manuscript. If you've been writing in Times New Roman, change it to Arial, change it to Comic Sans. I don't care. Just make it look different, and your brain is going to process it differently. Connected to that, also try reading it on different like formats. So print it out and read it. Or if you've been working on your laptop, try reading it on your phone or your tablet or your iPad, whatever you have. Just try to get it into a different setting so your brain is processing it differently. And then the one that I swear by is listening to it. And that can
Hmm.
be reading it out loud to your partner or your cat or the picture of Justin Bieber on the wall. I don't care. I personally love using text to speech software. I personally use Speechify. There's lots of options out there, but listening to it goes that extra step further and having your brain process it differently, and you're going to catch so many typos and awkward wordings and name misspellings and all of that kind of stuff that your eyes are just going to skim over, but your ears will catch it. So those are my two tips for catching the spelling, grammar, punctuation, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So a couple things to add to that. One, when I do my final proofread of my book before, so self-publishing, doing the final read through, I actually just in Word, I click the read function, and the book's read to me with a very it's not like a great voice. And I actually switch, it's kind of funny. I switch from the male to female voices when it's my male female if I'm
I
doing a
love
dual
that.
POV. And that lets you hear the cadence with how your commas are set to make sure it's the right cadence.
Yep.
And then you do catch some other little things. So that's always the very last thing that I do when I'm doing a proofread. Now this is like really nitty gritty. So when when I was kind of thinking like when you're sending to a contest or even to a friend, or if you're going to send it traditionally, you're sending it to a an editor or an agent. It doesn't you don't have to pay for an editor for a traditional. They will For traditional publishing, you do not edit it with a professional editor. You are just going to do it as best you can yourself. So that's what I was kind of
And
talking
if it's
about.
really
So I
rough,
wouldn't be quite
sometimes
so.
if
Oh,
it's
what?
really, really rough, sometimes it's a good idea to get a professional to look at it just so that you get accepted by the agent or whatever. But yeah, it's definitely not the standard expectation.
Right. They are going to pay for you, or they're going to set up an editor for you. But when I was just querying one of my manuscripts, I had the first two chapters professionally edited just to make sure I hadn't hadn't missed anything major, but just to as that. And then my other tool that I was going to say is to read it backwards. And that doesn't mean to read it like you're not reading the words backwards. You're starting at maybe the end of the chapter, and you're reading sentence by sentence backwards. So you're reading it sentence by sentence level. It's not getting connected in your head as a narrative because you're reading it, kind of out of sync.
Right.
So that's another tip to get, if you didn't want to use an AI tool like Grammarly or Pro Writing Aid.
I have heard that before and I forgot about it and it breaks my brain a little bit. So I might have to try it out on my current work in progress just to see what that's like because just hearing about it sounds so strange, but that might be exactly what I need. So I'll be giving that a try.
And then the last one was under style was around the five senses, and that's part of the immersion and the showing and aspect, and maybe we could have added that kind of into that part of the conversation we had. But one thing that I think writers tend to be really good at is visual description and what the character is seeing. Sometimes people forget about the four other senses. So what they're smelling, what they're hearing, what they're experiencing, maybe what they're tasting. Uh certainly if they're, kind of kissing, they're kind of experiencing a lot of different things. There might be, some I guess tasting there. But just trying to think about adding in more things than just the visual part.
And I agree that tasting is probably the hardest to do.
Yeah.
I'm really good with the sights, I'm decent with the sounds and the touch and the smells and all that kind of stuff. So what I've come down to on my own work and helping my clients with the taste sense is you don't have to name, oh, it tasted salty, oh, it tasted sweet.
Mhm.
Just give them things in the story that they can imagine how it tastes. Like in Lord of the Rings, just the descriptions of the llama spread include mentions of foods where they in their own minds can remember what that tastes like or imagine what that tastes like. So you don't always have to describe, oh, it's a rough texture. Just mention that there's bark under her hand. Or don't mention that it's sweet. Just mention that he's drinking a strawberry smoothie or something like that. Just to add a little bit of more of my how I approach that topic.
Yeah, yeah. You're right. You don't need to over explain. I think it's good to find a balance, or to figure out how to bring in world details or sensory details where it's just like, just a tiny little thing that's maybe a tiny sentence, or just a little bit of an addition to a sentence. And it's just adding those layers onto the story to make it more and more impactful and more deeply immersive. And those are things that really just come through as you're editing and editing, because you really think about that first chapter. It's rough. It's this story. You've kind of told it to yourself. You've figured out the plot. You've figured out what's happening. And then each time you're editing it, you're adding more nuance, you're adding more beautiful language, you're crafting your sentences, you're figuring out other things to bring in on the character, and how they're processing things, or how they see things, or what they care about, that and what, and it's an important, even what they see, what
Yeah.
they smell, what they hear is going to reveal things about your character, because we can all be in a room together, and maybe I see the dog because I love dogs. Maybe someone else sees the kitchen because they're remodeling their kitchen and they want to compare it. So it's like all different things that come through, from our perspectives, what's important to us. So that also can come through with your characters. And that's what makes writing so much fun, is to figure out what the character is going to care about and see, hear, smell, touch, that kind of thing. So
Absolutely agreed. Cool. So I think you said that was the last element under
yes.
style. What is our third category for today?
So dialogue. Dialogue is by far the area where I think people struggle the most. And there's a couple of components to dialogue. I would say that maybe three things that I would talk about is, first of all, knowing how to properly punctuate and handle dialogue. The second is beats and tags and when to use them.
Mhm.
And the third is just having the dialogue sound natural, the natural cadence of how we talk. So maybe to start with really quickly, just punctuation. Just look it up, study it. Just it's just one of those things you just have to read about it, look at it, and figure out. And you don't have to be perfect. That's what spell check and the what we were just talking about, these different programs, or checks that you can do. Even your word spelling and grammar check is going to catch this stuff. So just understanding the basics for how to properly punctuate dialogue,
Mhm.
and to how to do, if you wanted to do like a break when you're using M dashes, or a break when you're using commas, just to know how to do that. For one, it'll also save you a lot of time and energy with your editor, and may even be a reduced fee if your copy editor does not have to correct all your dialogue. I know when I started working with my editor, she told me, "Oh, it'll take 3 weeks for me to go through your manuscript." And then she came back to me and she said, "No, it won't, because your dialogue's fine. It'll only take me a week and a half." And so, so there's just to mention that.
I will admit that the M dash break in dialogue is one that I still can never draft correctly. So I just have it written out in my editing plan. I've got God, like 500 different points of editing things that I try to hit going through my own work. And one of them is just a reminder of how that's supposed to look. And then I go through and make sure that that always matches, and it never does from the first draft. So, again, as you mentioned on the last point, you don't have to put all of this emphasis on the drafting, because I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. Just
Mhm.
draft. Make all the mistakes in the first draft, and then come back to this stuff in the editing where the actual bits and pieces get chipped away till you have the statue that you were going for.
No, same. I have bookmarks for that stuff because I never remember. Even though I love my M dash is probably a little too much, and I just have my bookmarks to remind me on how to do that. I think when I start every book, I'm like, oh, I forget this again.
Yep, 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 yep.
So totally understand. What was the second one I had said? I think, well, so natural, having the speech sound natural. So even if you are writing in a fantasy time, or in an olden times, or um you're trying to have things be formal, just think about how we still would naturally speak to each other, how we would address each other. Are we going to be using names all the time? Am I going to, I mean, we've been talking here for about an hour. um how many times did I actually say your name? Oh, Rebecca, what do you think about this? Oh, Rebecca, so you don't
Right.
want to be having the character saying the other person's name all the time because that doesn't sound natural.
Yeah.
The other like element that I see a lot is people defaulting to non-contracted speech
Yeah.
to try to create maybe a formal style character. Um, but unfortunately, that is very tedious for the reader to read. There are ways to make sure, even if you even if you do want to kind of have them be non-contracting their speech, it's the same as with an accent, just tiny little bits to set the scene for that character that this is how they speak, and it's also what they say and the things around them, so their actions and how they're processing things. There's lots of ways to make sure it's clear that this is a maybe a formal world or a formal character, and not defaulting to speech because it's really hard to read the non-contracted speech, and it could be in the dialogue, it could be in their inner thoughts too, and then it gets really old really fast, and it's hard to read. It's really hard to read. And I'm going to say I've done this my very first book. One of my
Same.
characters was a really old character, and I did this 100%. And and I got the same feedback, like, this is hard to read. And you really need to think about dialogue where it's not representing exactly how we speak to each other. It needs to be natural, so you need to have the cadence with how we speak to each other, but you're not going to be putting in the ers, the wells, the so, which is probably what I'm doing while I'm speaking on this podcast as I'm saying so well. But in a book, you cut all that out. It needs
Right.
to flow. You want to have it flow, but it needs to sound natural. It needs to be true to what the character is saying. For example, if you are an old-fashioned character, they're not going to be using slang. They're not going to be thinking in slang. They're not going to, modern terms. So even your word choice, the word okay, that's a more modern word. You're not going to use that in a book that takes place in a fantasy world that's more of an olden times. So my books, I based it kind of on the 1800s England. It was fantasy, but that was my mindset, was to use that kind of time period as where I was thinking. And it was hard. I'd be, okay, is this word a real word that they would use as they're like processing something? So, words like okay, all that was just out completely. So things like that. So your word choice.
That's one of my favorite things to catch when I'm editing historical fiction is just, hey, by the way, that word doesn't make sense. Or even in fantasy, someone will say something, oh god damn it. I'm like, oh, there are gods in your world? You haven't established that. And it's
Yes.
fascinating, just the sort of vocabulary, lexicon, and idioms that we take so much for granted in our speech. And yeah, we have to make it sound natural, but also natural for that character and their time, place, and situation. And I recently heard the lack of contractions in speech, that over formality, described as British butler syndrome, and I absolutely adored that because
Yep.
that's what happens, and I've seen that in a couple of high fantasies that I've edited, is just everyone is talking like the British butler, and it's fascinating the impact that that has on a story, and it's not usually a good one.
No, and I mean, to that point, all of your characters should be slightly different.
Right.
And you should really be able to capture who that character is, and the reader should really be able to tell for the most part, that these are distinct characters. And if you open the book and you're reading some dialogue, you should be able to capture, oh, it's this character, that's speaking on page here. So if they all sound really formal, then they all sound the same as well, So that's important. And I had a similar story I was reading that was like that. They were all very, very formal. They all sounded similar. And I actually, for most of the first chapter, had no idea that the person that she was addressing by name was her father.
Oh.
She was addressing him by name, by
Yeah.
his name. And I and, fi- and when it came up later in the chapter, I went, wait a minute, because it's not natural. I mean, even as if it's formal, maybe she'd say father, not like dad. But
Right.
but still, it's just not very normal for someone to address their parent by their name, and it was
No.
very confusing for me as the reader. So that was something, to kind of point out and
Yeah.
give them some points at. And so you're a great writing partner for people who are writing in historical times because you know a lot about the time period so you can help keep them true to to the to the period because that's it's great. I mean, that's why writing partners, critique groups are so important.
Yeah. And the only thing I want to add to the topic of dialogue here is something that you kind of touched on a second ago of, not just using dialogue to state a name to denote characters. Connected to that, one of my biggest pet peeves that I'll see in dialogue is line so and so said, line other person said, line first person said, line second person said, line like, and it's just so many name said, name said, name said, name said, name said down this paragraph, and it drives me nuts. So, what I like to recommend is three different approaches. The first is use some unusual dialogue tags. And I know that some editors will absolutely hate me for saying that, but said is invisible. That's the idea behind the advice of always use said or asked when you can. And unusual dialogue tags are visible, and overuse of them can be exhausting. But now and then, if you have a bunch of saids in a row, replacing one with a more unusual dialogue tag that adds nuance and depth and immersion can help break that monotony. My second piece of advice for that is just trust your reader to track the conversation. You
Hmm.
don't need to tag every line of dialogue. I recommend tagging like every third to fifth if it's needed. If it's two people in a room, you can get away with a ton. If you have multiple people in a room, it gets a little more complicated. And then the third piece of advice is you don't always have to tag it with they said or they asked or they whispered or something like that. It can be an action tag. You can show Daniel turned up the collar of his coat, and then just put the line of dialogue and use your paragraph breaks to denote that. So that's one of the things that I pay attention to on the editing that I do of just please don't do that repetitive she said, he said, she said, he said. That's the only thing I have to add to that.
Yeah, that was actually my third one. Was I was going to say beats and tags. So
Oh yeah.
so the tag is exactly what you said, which is there's a line of dialogue and the tag is he said, or Jocelyn said, Rebecca said.
Mhm.
That's a tag. I said that the said is the tag or asked. And
Uh-huh.
just like you said and asked are typically invisible. The reader doesn't see it, their brain doesn't even process it because it's just so kind of embedded in how we read. um, and the recommendation is to use those as well as any kind of volume modifier. So whispered, shouted. So obviously those are important as well because you need to denote volume. And to your point, using an action beat instead of the tag is always preferable and helps break that up so that it's not, he said, line, she said, that kind of thing back and forth. Um, and the other element that I'd wanted to which I think sorry, just to go back for a second, I think you did a great example where you said Daniel pulled up his collar and then the next line of dialogue, which would maybe, ooh, it's getting cold out here, we would know Daniel's saying that because of that dialogue and it's all in the same paragraph. It's properly structured, so we know that he's the one who said it because it's right next to that. So that's always a great way to break things up. um when you were getting into like, oh, dialogue, one line, second line, third line, that can also get into the talking head syndrome where
Yeah.
there's just no real context to the the environment and what's going on and what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, how the characters are reacting to each other, or even in the point of view character that we're in, how they're processing the conversation and what, are they angry about what's being said? Are they happy? Are they upset? Are they getting frustrated? So just having like that part come in is important as well.
That's great
I
advice. I forget
read
about that, so
a
it's good to have that.
good, what was that?
That's great advice, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's an element that I tend to forget in my own writing. I can usually catch it in editing, but I forget that so often in my own writing.
And usually it's something that you will, you know, find in a future edit,
Right.
as
Yeah.
you're going through. And I think one thing that, you were saying, you don't have to even attribute all dialogue. You could just have a line that doesn't have a tag, doesn't have an action beat on it. As long as it's clear who's speaking. And I think that's one benefit of if you put your manuscript aside for a little while, maybe you start writing something else and you kind of have forgotten it a little, and then you
Mhm.
read it again. If you can't follow who's speaking, then you need to add a beat or a tag. But conversely, maybe you're looking and you realize, oh, I said for every single line. I don't need to do that. It's very clear who's speaking. There's only two people. So I can remove some of this. So sometimes having that fresh set of your own eyes on a manuscript helps a lot.
Yeah. I actually bought an Elmore Leonard book today specifically because I've heard so many people talk about how brilliant he is at untagged dialogue and still being able to track it because his character voices are so unique. So I bought a book today just to go read how someone else did that really well. So I'm glad this came up.
Nice. And I would say a lot of great mystery and police procedurals are like this too. It's a lot of dialogue. They're interviewing people. They're talking amongst themselves and trying to figure the case out. And they're talking to witnesses. And there's a lot of dialogue. And kind of zipping through the dialogue and being able to know who's saying what and handling that well. I think those are some other places where I see it and kind
Yeah.
of admire what they're doing.
Another reason to read broadly.
Yes, exactly. Um, yeah, I this is very off topic. I have a hard time reading in my genre sometimes. Sometimes I think once I really started writing romance a lot, I just couldn't read fantasy romance books. I could read other like subgenres in romance, like historical or contemporary, because that's not what I was writing. But I have a hard time. So I definitely read, really broadly because I haven't been reading as much of the fantasy romance.
Fair enough.
And I've actually gotten some amazing ideas on books from like nonfiction that I've been reading,
Nice.
which is kind of funny.
That's cool. All right. What's
So
up
yeah.
next?
So the last broad topic I was going to talk about was characterization and characters.
Nice.
And I have a couple just little things under that.
Cool.
And there's always a judging category on are the characters sympathetic and believable? And I wanted to, I mentioned this, earlier we were going to talk about this and talk about how to really help your reader attach to your character right away. We were talking about openings. And
Mhm.
there's really two ways that you can think about doing this. There's multiple ways, but two big ones that really work is to create empathy for your character right away, which gets your reader like rooting for them and caring about them. And the other is to show your character being really good at something and really skilled, because then your reader's like, "Oh, well that's interesting. Maybe it's an interesting job. Maybe it's an interesting skill. If you're writing fantasy, maybe it's some pretty cool magic." So you're getting them then invested in the character because you want to see more of what they're doing, and or you feel bad for them. They're in a terrible situation that they need to dig themselves out of, and you want to see what's going to happen. A really good example of this is the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. That book opens up. Robert Langdon's in the middle of there's a murder that's happened and he's being kind of pointed at as a potential suspect. So we've got empathy for him because we know he's innocent because we followed him. He was in the taxi kind of coming to this museum. So we know he wasn't there. And then he's also got this really crazy cool job. He decodes he he decodes and looks at symbols in um, famous paintings, famous works.
Uh-huh.
And so that's a fascinating job. And so he's looking at these symbols and these codes, and that just gets the book off and running. And that book isn't necessarily written with prose that we're quoting, but it's just grabs you and you don't want to stop reading once you start.
So would you
So
count the save the cat idea of having your protagonist simply do something that shows their character really well into one of those categories, or would you say that that's a third sort of approach to it?
yeah, I think it would be one of the categories. It would be the showing your character um being really skilled at something. So whether it's within their job or their hobby or whatever it is, it's just
Mhm.
showing them in this really interesting positive light. Um and
Cool.
yeah, it doesn't have to be their profession or anything like that, but I think that's she mentions that in Saving the Cat as well, that really kind of giving the readers a reason to root for this person. Why is this person interesting? With
Cool. Okay.
fantasy, it's okay, we want to drop into this different world, or our world in a different that's been represented in a different fantasy realm.
Mhm.
And so show them the really cool stuff you've got coming and what this character can do. And so kind of circling back to goal, motivation, and conflict. And so we were talked about it in plot before, and just making sure we already talked about this quite a bit, but that it's true to the character as well and their
And
internal.
consistent throughout is also really important.
Right, exactly. Um, and I think the last is just that their emotion is appropriate to how they're processing the scene, that it's true, that it makes sense, that if it's a very something that's rather minor, that's kind of irritating, that they're not flying off the handle and acting in this crazy over the top way that just wouldn't make a lot of sense, or that people wouldn't understand that motivation. Maybe there is a motivation or a reason why they're flying off the handle, but if you haven't brought the reader up to speed on why that would be a trigger point, then they're going to be struggling to understand that, drastic difference.
Yeah.
Um,
I recently actually edited a book where that was one of my biggest points of feedback at the end was, hey, you're one of the two protagonists. He's makes me as a reader untrusting of him because his emotional reactions don't fit reality and don't have reasoning behind them. So I think that's a fantastic point to bring up.
yeah, right, exactly. I mean, you want to understand these people. You want to be experiencing their world and really, like you said, trusting them. Um, and so the last is really just making sure that your character has has both their flaws and their virtues. So sometimes it can be a little challenging to read a book where the heroine's being presented as she's gorgeous and she can get anyone she wants, and it's like, okay, well, that could be true. She could be the kind of this man-eater type character, but she's not perfect. She's
Nobody is.
there,
Yeah.
nobody is. So it's really important to make sure that you're showing a character in a very layered, um, honest way, in a way that we see real people in the real world. So um so yeah, I think that was everything that I had written down from some of the points that I tend to talk about a lot in the different judging contests that I do.
This has been fabulous. I've learned a bit. I'm sure our listeners will learn tons, and it's especially fascinating getting this from someone with your background in those specific contexts of the competitions and a bit more on the trad side than I have any connection with. So this has been absolutely delightful, and I can't wait to re-listen through everything and jot down the book recommendations and all that sort of stuff.
Oh,
So
cool.
for now, what's up next for you in your editing journey? What more are you hoping to do with it, and what areas are you hoping to sort of grow or learn more about going forward?
Yeah, yeah, great question. I still pick up books all the time, and I write write notes and read them, and really try to learn as much as I can. Try to keep refining my craft and also refining my abilities as a critique partner and as an editor. I mean, a lot of the reasons why I started reading a lot of these books was to be able to have a better vocabulary to help my critique partners and be able to explain why I felt the way I felt about a character, or why I was kind of confused about something. So, I'm continuing to take classes and read books, and um, I don't take on a lot of editing clients. I'm trying to focus on my books. I'm in the middle of writing. I've also had some offers for my most recent manuscript to go through traditional publishing. So I've been working with that. So I've been doing got a couple different things in the fire. Um, so but I would say that, especially if someone just wanted their first chapter looked at, but if someone did want to reach out to me to ask about their book, or maybe connect with me to have a review, just to go to my website, jocelynmontana.com, and go to the contact me page and just send me an email and what you're looking for, what you need, and we could connect on that. But yeah, it's something I kind of do a little bit on
Sure.
I guess a little slower, little on a little bit on the side, piecemeal here and there. So that's kind of where I'm at for the journey with that. We're
Awesome.
focusing a little bit more on the writing side.
Fair. Yeah, I also love just keeping up on reading new nonfiction books on writing. The
Mm,
one that I finished reading actually today, which was the perfect setup to do this interview with you, is called "The Five Editors Tackle the 12 Fatal Flaws of Fiction
mhm.
Writing." It's in the Writer's Toolbox series, and it is so good. So I just had to mention it
Excellent
in this
book.
podcast episode to recommend it to anyone who's looking to just expand on the exact topic that we've been talking about today. I will absolutely be doing a full-blown, like, in-depth review of this book at some point in the future. It was so incredibly helpful and covered so much of what we just talked about.
I
So,
almost brought that book to this to this meeting. As yes,
yes.
it's an excellent resource, and really, yes, goes into um, deeper dives into most of the things we've been talking about here. I know there's a whole section like on backstory and when to bring it in and how to do it. And
Yep.
yeah, really, really great stuff. Definitely recommend. The other plug I'd love to give, one of my favorite resources to recommend, is Marcy Kennedy's Busy Writer Guide. They're short, they're easy to read, and she has different topics. So dialogue, show and tell, uh point of view, deep point of view. She has two books on that. All of them are really excellent. And quick, like I said, quick reads, not very expensive books. They're not big books, and I always recommend those to readers or to writers.
Fabulous. Awesome. Well, Jocelyn, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been wonderfully educational, and it's always a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I look forward to bringing you more content to help you make a good story great so it can change lives and change your world. Follow along to hear more, or visit my website linked in the description to learn how I can help you and your story to flourish. See you next time.